Last week on my Tumblr, I shared a series of soft WLW asks. Now, if you know anything about Tumblr, you know that 80% of what Tumblr is, besides just fandom content, is basically people sharing ask memes and trying to get other people to ask them things with nobody really asking each other anything. But I actually got lucky and I did get someone to send me an ask, and this particular ask got me thinking. So the question was, talk about the girl who made you realize you liked girls. So I started thinking about it and I realized it wasn't just one girl. It was a series of girls that led to what the Queen Oprah calls my aha moment. The moment in which I realized that not only could I be attracted to women, but that I was, and then it completely changed my world. It's hard to pinpoint exactly where I think it started, but the first time I can actually remember, and in this case, we're not gonna count pre-transition crushes, because I actually did have a lot of pre-transition crushes, and I even had a girlfriend when I was 14. But for the sake of this video, we're gonna be talking about women loving women crushes. So in this case, after I had transitioned. So the first time I could remember was a coworker who I'd become friends with pretty much a year after I'd started my last job. At that point, we had just been promoted to a sort of not middle management, but like middle management position. Pretty early on, I found myself strangely attracted to her for reasons that at the time I couldn't quite understand. We even ended up having a conversation about it in which she explained she tended to give off a more masculine energy and that it happened to her quite a bit. At the time, I wrote it off as something of a fluke, just a one-time thing that would probably never happen again. It was the first time since my early teens that I'd actually had a crush on a girl. To say that it threw me off would be a bit of an understatement. At the time, we were both in relationships with men, and I wasn't quite comfortable calling myself bi because this was the first time this had happened to me. As far as I was concerned, this was just a one-time thing that probably wouldn't happen again. Confusing though it was, I did my best not to think about it. And after her, it really didn't happen for a long time. I mean, okay, yeah, sure, maybe I had a crush on Rachel Maddow, but like, who doesn't? And yeah, okay, maybe I enjoyed writing like lesbian erotica for scenes in my novels a little more than a straight trans woman should, but like, it happens. For the most part, after my coworker, I can't really point to another woman and say, yes, she's the one. She's responsible for this. Ironically, as I mentioned in a previous video, until my ex came out to me as trans, I was under the impression that I was dating a man. And so when they did come out to me, it wasn't something I was actually prepared to deal with. It's almost embarrassing now and perhaps a little bit funny that part of the reason we broke up was that I wasn't really prepared to be dating a woman. You would think that I, of all people, would understand coming out as trans. And I really did try to be understanding. For the first month or so of our relationship, I really tried to make it work. At that point, I had pretty much labeled myself hetero-flexible, which is to say that while I leaned towards men, I thought to myself that if I ever did fall in love with a woman, I wouldn't exactly say no to that opportunity. And yet, here I was in a relationship with someone who turned out to be a woman, and I wasn't prepared to deal with it. Now, there are a lot more factors that go into play here, none of which I'm going to detail in this video because they're not actually relevant to the video. And as anyone who's ever been bi can tell you, just because you can potentially date someone doesn't mean you necessarily will. Ironically, I don't think this relationship played any major factor in my ultimate realization that I did like women. One of the largest contributing factors, and stay with me here because this might sound a little strange, was in the summer of 2018 when I started writing for the Harry Potter fandom. At that point, I had existed in the fandom in some way, shape, or form for years, but until that moment in August, I hadn't actually written anything for the fandom, or at least nothing I was brave enough to post. Over the course of the next 2 years, I began to explore different relationship dynamics that began to cause me to question my sexuality more and more. Namely, the relationship between Hermione Granger and Pansy Parkinson. Something about the dynamic between these two characters who were otherwise virtual strangers in the actual canon story fascinated me. I think what ultimately turned the tide for me to realizing that I could like women was the increasing amount of Tumblr lesbians that I was starting to follow and my sort of introduction to butch women. I should preface this by saying that this was not a discovery as if I had never seen them before, but it was sort of the discovery in which I realized that I could actually be attracted to them. And not only that I could, but that I was. And not only did I find them attractive, I was starting to catch feelings. Enter quarantine. Okay, so in all of my videos over the past few months, since I would say February-ish, although there haven't been many, I haven't really acknowledged what's been going on as far as the pandemic. I've acknowledged other things that have been going on, things that I felt more important. This pandemic is something I haven't quite been able to muster up the energy to mention. And the truth is, I haven't mentioned it not for the reasons that most YouTubers don't really mention it, in the sense that they have something to lose. I'm not really monetized, so I don't really have anything to lose by having these conversations. Instead, I haven't mentioned it because it's frankly exhausting. It's an all-encompassing part of our lives, and it's not something that I felt the need to discuss here. We all know what's going on, and we all know that it sucks. Unfortunately for me, it's kind of a relevant part to this story, so I guess I have to bring it up. Picture it. February 2020. It was basically the start of the pandemic, and in an odd way, it feels like it was like 30 years ago and not like 5 months ago. I just started training at my new job and found myself following an entirely new blog that was run by a very handsome woman who I found myself sort of drawn to. So I ended up deciding to send her a message. I'm not nearly that brave normally, and I think I ended up sending the message on anonymous just to say, hey, and see if maybe we could spark some sort of conversation. She ended up responding to the message, and within a couple of back and forth messages over a series of several days, she ended up admitting that she actually preferred to talk on the phone rather than just sending constant back and forth messages. Now, normally I wouldn't give out my number to otherwise virtual strangers, but something about me was feeling bold, and so I thought, what the hell. That first night we talked for hours, though it felt like mere minutes. I couldn't even tell you what all we talked about because we talked about literally anything and everything. By the next night, we probably talked about 7 hours, and the night after that, probably 5. And at that point, she probably knew about as much about me as friends of mine who had known me for a decade or more. And at that point, I was pretty smitten. I'll admit, I catch feelings kind of fast and pretty hard, and I don't exactly like that trait about myself, but here we are. So I did what any fanfic writer with a crush would do. I wrote her a fanfic to explain how I felt about her. I didn't explicitly make it about her. I wanted it to be sort of clear, but also ambiguous, just in case it didn't work out. Mind you, this was all over the span of about a week, so eat your heart out, Bella Swan. Like I said, though, we had talked for at least 15 hours in a total of a week and a half. We had expressed thoughts and feelings that most people don't express in a lifetime of knowing each other. We had somehow compressed 15 plus years into about a week and a half. Eventually, we decided to have a FaceTime date. Now, neither of us knew at the time that it was a date. It was sort of a FaceTime, just getting to know each other. It wasn't until almost 3 hours later, after the FaceTime date had ended and we were texting back and forth, that we both kind of decided that yes, this was in fact a date. It was then she revealed that she actually realized that the story was about her. It didn't hurt that I had also created a Spotify playlist just in case that was specifically titled the same thing as the fanfiction was, even had all of the song titles put together so it specifically spelled out "It's You" when you looked at the first letters of each song title. Yes, I am that gay. Somewhere in the course of that back and forth of text, she admitted that she actually liked me back and even added in case that wasn't clear, which it kind of wasn't. She had said that she had liked the story, but never gave any indication that she thought it was about her, which was fair because it was, again, vague. It's about two characters that are already in the fandom. I just sort of made it seem about us. Needless to say, I was elated. Up until that point, I hadn't even really given it a possibility. Certainly, I had hoped, but I had kept the story vague enough just in case it didn't work out so that I could just say, oh, it's a story. It has nothing to do with us. Keep moving. In past experiences, things like this hadn't quite worked out for me. Now, I should preface this by saying I'd never actually written someone a story to tell them I liked them, but like, I wasn't sure how this was gonna go, but here she was, liking me back, and this was something that hadn't really happened to me before, especially not with another woman. She was even thrilled that I'd written her the story and found it terribly adorable. And try though I might to keep my mind in check, I sort of let it wander. I tried desperately in the days that followed to remind myself that it didn't necessarily mean anything. Obviously, someone liking you back and you guys having a FaceTime date does not a relationship make. There had been no declaration that we were in a relationship, it just happened to be something that we both liked each other kind of mutually. The sad truth is, try though I might, our mutual excitement for how adorably gay we both were had me already planning how I would tell my future never-to-exist grandchildren how we both met. Needless to say, I went to bed on cloud 9 and couldn't wait to get up the next morning to talk to her again. The next day, I didn't hear from her all that much, which wasn't entirely uncommon during the daytime. She did work, after all. She was one of the few people who had a job that wasn't going to close, and beyond that, she was spending the weekend with her friends and didn't really like to text much during that time. And I can respect that. The day after that, though, I still hadn't heard from her. I tried to remind myself that it was in fact a work day for her, and even though it was my day off, didn't mean that she could necessarily drop everything and just talk to me. As I said, it wasn't entirely uncommon not to hear from her for large chunks of time, but at this point we had been talking at least every day, and it was at least a day after we had kind of acknowledged that we both liked each other, and nothing had been said about it afterwards. So, needless to say, I started to panic. I should point out, and while I don't necessarily think this makes it better, that at this point in my life, I had already been ghosted by a number of people in past relationship things, so I kind of knew what was coming. I didn't understand what had happened, but I was fairly certain that somehow it was all my fault. It doesn't hurt that this was also in the beginning of the pandemic where everything was very unclear, so I was actually terribly nervous that she might be in the hospital somewhere. Needless to say, I was checking in on her kind of constantly, and by that Monday, I was fairly certain that whatever we had was over. In hindsight, this is entirely irrational. I knew I was overreacting. Logically, there was a part of my brain that knew you are overreacting. There's no reason to overreact. Just calm down. It's going to be fine. But the longer time went on, the more I started to realize that maybe I wasn't jumping to conclusions. It's hard to tell in hindsight whether or not it was my own actions or just the fact that she lost interest that ultimately ended up swaying the tide. I say all this to say that I let my anxiety get the better of me, and it wasn't a cute look. I'm not saying this to make her seem like the villain in this story and me like the victim. That's not the case at all. In fact, if anything, this story does not make me look great. I admit, and again, I'm not quite proud of this, that I sent several messages about how I thought she was probably pulling away out of fear. We were very similar in that way after all, and I felt that that was something I would do. You know, self-sabotage and all that. Needless to say, she never responded, and as far as I could tell, she had never even read the messages, which leads me to believe she had probably blocked me long before that. About a month later, I decided to take a peek on her Tumblr and discovered that she was actually dating someone that she had met on Tumblr, who was probably apparently also in the same vicinity as her. Again, this hurt, so I ended up sending another text message which went unread, which basically said, "You could have just told me that you were seeing someone. I'm a big girl. I can handle it." As far as I know, she never read the message, nor did she respond to the message. And at that point, I didn't really expect her to. I was sort of just saying it just to get it out of my system. This was my first actual lesbian heartbreak. If in the off chance this person is somehow watching this video, I'd like to formally apologize. Okay, so where does this all leave me? Well, as I mentioned in my last video, I haven't really had an attraction to a man since the start of this pandemic, so February of 2020. And I don't want to say that I think it's impossible, because to be quite honest, if 2020 has taught us anything, it's that, well, the things you think are impossible tend to be popping up a lot. Frankly, if you told me in 2018 that I would end up falling so hard for a woman and completely lose interest in men, I probably would have thought you were mad. So why did it take me so long to realize that not only that I could like women, but that I did? The short answer is, of course, TERFs. But that's not the whole answer. Frankly, it would be easy to blame the TERFs for everything that was wrong in my life, but I think that's a little disingenuous. It also didn't help that being a part of this community as I now am, I'm now having to face my dysphoria on a near constant basis, in a way in which I previously didn't have to. In watching and writing gay male erotica, I was able to take myself out of the equation in a way that allowed me to ignore the part of my anatomy that had caused me so much grief. But in seeing women together, I was confronted with it in a very real and personal way. Looking back, there were definitely signs that I was attracted to women, signs that I, like a lot of queer women, ignored. In fact, there's even a whole term for it, compulsory heterosexuality. It's a subject that I think Natalie Wynn described in her coming out video a lot better than I ever could. And frankly, I don't really think that that played a factor in ultimately why it took me so long. Interestingly enough, as someone who was assigned male at birth, I think I have sort of a unique experience when it comes to coming out as a woman who likes women. When you're assigned male at birth, there's sort of an expectation, at least for a while, that you will always be someone who likes women. The funny thing is, this expectation of heterosexuality only lasted about so long. Prior to the start of my transition in 2014, I was raised as a boy, and it wasn't something I ever even thought to try and fight. I didn't quite like it per se, at least as far as my clothing went, but it wasn't something that I had the terminology to even confront. It had never really occurred to me that it was even something I could do. But from a very young age, I was always clocked as femme. In fact, my earliest memory of being called gay or girly was around the 4th grade, and at the time, I had no concept of what those words even meant. I grew up in a very religious Republican household, or at least that's what my family was. My mother was pretty chill, and she never tried to dissuade me from anything, but I'd be lying if I said that it was something that was even discussed. The fact that gay people exist wasn't something that was really acknowledged in my family. Even before I had a concept of what it even would mean to be gay, I was terrified of the consequences of the people around me finding out about it. And so I did what any person in that position would do. I deflected, I lied, and even prayed. In an ironic twist, actually, I think that my becoming a trans lesbian is almost my prayer at 14 answered, just not quite in the way I expected. Damn you, Catholic God, and your monkey's paw of answering prayers. Actually, okay, let me be honest for just like a hot second. I'm actually happy that I'm trans. I know this may be hard to believe as someone who often talks about dysphoria and needing SRS, but I'm not upset about this. I'm happy that I'm a trans woman. It can be difficult at times, I will admit that, but for the most part, I know that I'm very fortunate and very blessed, and I'm happy to be who I am. I'm happy with who I am. And that's not something I could have said even a few years ago. Needless to say, this presumption of my sexuality continued into my teens and early 20s. Most of the time, I was clocked as female, rarely, if ever, as a gay man. Honestly, the amount of times I was called ma'am, or if I was in a group of other girls, which I often was, ladies was used, I've lost count. Ironically, at the time, I was sort of deep in my denial, and the constant misgendering was sort of infuriating. I remember one time, a friend of mine and I were kind of teasing each other / arguing, and a guy who we had never seen or met had followed us from where we had had lunch all the way through the hall into our next class to ask if we were lesbians. At the time, I was fairly confident that if I was anything, I was a gay boy, but I wasn't about to admit this to this otherwise perfect stranger in the middle of my high school. As an aside, really fast, I do want to say that I don't want this video to come across as me thinking that my feelings for men were ever disingenuous, because I honestly don't think that they were. All of the men that I was attracted to over the years, I think I was honestly attracted to.
It's worth noting, or at least I think it is, that in hindsight, a lot of the men that I was interested in and have been interested over the years have been kind of more on the feminine side.
I merely wish to point out that there are other factors at play. The reality is, sexuality is complicated. In a weird way, I think these days we might give people a little more room to explore their sexuality than we did in the past, but it's an odd sort of dichotomy that allows younger people to explore their sexuality and forces older people to make a decision and stick to it with very rigid rules. If you're older, you're expected to just know who you are. And if you change your mind or something changes, then that's on you. Not to borrow a very common YouTuber refrain these days, but I'm not the same person I was 6 months ago, let alone 6 years ago at the start of my transition, or even a decade ago when I came out as gay. Frankly, none of us are the same people we were at the beginning of all of this. People grow, people change, what we're attracted to changes, what we want changes. Sometimes even our hopes and dreams and expectations for the future change, and that's okay. That's kind of a good thing. Frankly, we should change and grow and get better. Stagnation shouldn't be an option. I'll be honest, my vision for my future looks a lot different than it did when I was 16. And though that can be scary at times, I think it's actually for the best. If anything, it shows how much I've grown over the years. In an odd way, I feel like my attraction to women, while unexpected, really shouldn't have been. As I said, prior to my transition, there were a few people that I was attracted to, but even after my transition, there were still people that I was attracted to. I shouldn't have allowed myself to fall into this trap that sexuality has to be very rigid and one thing or another. But the truth is, even now, part of the reason I'm so reticent to say anything other than I'm queer is because I don't want to end up saying anything that ends up being disproven later. I would hate to, as I said last week, come out as a lesbian and then end up falling for a man and have to retract that statement. Honestly, at this point, I'm not really sure that bi is a label that still fits me. But for right now, queer is. And so as long as that remains true, I'm going to stick with that. And assuming it doesn't, I will be sure to make another video and let you all know. Thank you all so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to leave a comment down below, like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe. I really enjoy making these videos. I thought this video was a lot of fun to write. It was certainly a lot of fun to film. I love feeling my Natalie Wynn ContraPoints fantasy with these colored lights over here. It actually changes a lot when you turn off this ring light. Ooh, but look at that. Oh my God, stunning. Ooh, stunning. Oh. Now that is living my best femme life, bitch.